During the most recent episode of Piers Morgan Uncensored, progressive political commentators David Pakman and Brian Tyler Cohen visibly triggered their MAGA Republican counterparts on the panel, and it was glorious, and we have to talk about it. But before we do, if you end up liking this video and you want to support the channel, please be sure to hit the like, subscribe, and alert bells before you go. All right, friends, we have several clips to talk about in this video. As you know, we cover a lot of Piers Morgan's content because even though I have my legitimate grievances with him in terms of his commentary with respect to U.S. politics, mostly that he professes to be a nonpartisan, even though he's clearly a strident Trump supporter, and I just wish he'd be more open about that. The fact of the matter is he's one of the biggest, most influential names in independent media, and his panels are usually wildly entertaining, even when it comes to U.S. politics, and this is no exception. So I'm going to play this first clip here, which is the most viral moment of the many in this 57-minute exchange, and that is Dave Rubin losing his mind at David Pakman.
People than they know about themselves.
Absolutely ridiculous.
And by the way, you know, this has nothing to do with a well-funded evil money machine that the Republicans were doing. There's something called boys and girls, and
Rubin's
they are
the right
different.
guy to talk about
and
that,
most
isn't
parents, oh God, you're such a smug prick. Listen, most parents actually want to defend their daughters and don't want them to have the kids.
So the broader context for this particular tangent is they were discussing trans issues and their prevalence in the 2024 election. We'll talk about that in a second. But the specific thing that Pacman said, which triggered Rubin, is because when David Pakman and Brian Tyler Cohen were making, in my opinion, the correct case that MAGA Republicans were cynically exploiting trans issues and trying to suggest that Democrats were overly fixated on niche trans issues rather than so-called kitchen table issues. Rubin derided this as a so-called, multi-billion dollar scheme, well-financed scheme. Well, the reason that Pacman laughed is because a company that Dave Rubin was attached to, Tenet Media, was recently indicted by the Department of Justice, it was implicated in an indictment by the Department of Justice as being basically patsies for Russian interference, that basically Russia intelligence was using Tenet Media to proliferate anti-American, pro-Russian, anti-democratic propaganda. And since Rubin was attached to that company, his reputation has been undermined as a consequence, even though he himself has not been indicted and he denies all wrongdoing. But that was the admittedly hilarious cheap shot that David Pakman was making at Dave Rubin, and Dave Rubin didn't like that. Now, before we go back to some more clips from Piers Morgan, I just will say on the topic of trans issues in the 2024 election, Sarah McBride, who is the first openly trans woman elected to Congress, actually in the 2024 election. This is where she won her victory. She'll be representing Delaware in the House of Representatives. This is what she had to say about the claim that Democrats lost in part because Kamala Harris and the Democrats were overly fixated on niche trans issues as opposed to everyday economic concerns of Americans.
Let's be clear. The party that was focused on culture wars, the party that was focused on trans people, was the Republican Party. It was Donald Trump. It was the $100 million, $200 million that they spent on television ads.
And she puts out, by the way, a great 2-minute statement to this effect where she says, her identity was not something that she campaigned on, even though it's obviously part of who she is. Just a really powerful response to this claim that, Democrats, the Democratic Party, Kamala Harris were campaigning on these niche culture war issues, when in fact it was the Republicans who, sought to misrepresent and exaggerate the Democratic Party's interest in culture war issues and pretend that that was the entirety or the majority of their campaign. And that was the $200 million ad that Congresswoman McBride referenced in her response there. I will also say on the topic of trans issues as well that we are seeing an ever-increasing number of anti-trans legislation that's coming from red states. And I can't imagine that's going to be helped at all with Donald Trump back in the White House, particularly since he's aided and abetted by culture warriors in the Republican Party in both the House and the Senate. So I expect attacks on trans people in this country will only continue, which is yet another reason why Donald Trump's victory is so disastrous for the American people. But the fact of the matter is, Vice President Harris wasn't campaigning on culture war issues. She wasn't campaigning on trans issues. She was campaigning, however, whether you like it or not, whether you agree it was a good idea, and it certainly didn't win the election, she was campaigning on ideas for the American people, on economic issues, the opportunity economy and building 3 million new homes and startup business loans and expanded child tax credits. She tried to make the case that she was campaigning for the American people. And to the extent that the anti-trans ad from Donald Trump was successful, I would argue they were exploiting the perception among many on the right that Kamala Harris was, what was the quote, for they, them, whereas Donald Trump is for you. It tested off the charts, but in terms of its substance, I just believe that the Democratic Party, that was not reflective of what the Democratic Party was campaigning on. That's my opinion. So let's get back to the Piers Morgan clips. We got some other clips here. David Pacman and Brian Tyler Cohen taking turns humiliating Ben Ferguson, who is Ted Cruz's sidekick on The Verdict, which is a Ted Cruz podcast, and Dave Rubin, formerly of the Young Turks.
I want to discuss other things, all right?
When you lost.
I want to play a clip of Donald Trump at the White House today. He's just met Joe Biden, and this is what happened.
Politics is tough, and it's, in many cases, not a very nice world, but it is a nice world today, and I appreciate it very much. A transition that's so smooth, it'll be as smooth as it can get, and I very much appreciate that, Jim.
You're welcome. Now, Dave, I've got to say, kudos to Joe Biden for doing that. Would it not have been better for America if Donald Trump had done that himself 4 years ago? Serious question.
Yeah, I think you can make that argument, but I think we're long past that.
How pathetic is Dave Rubin? I mean, you can see Cohen, Brian Tyler Cohen, and David Pacman just scoffing at this. Like, I mean, I guess you could have, like, I don't know, make the argument that, like, a president should commit to a peaceful transfer of power, I guess. But I mean, like, we're so far past that. So pathetic and unprincipled. If the shoe had been on the other foot, and if Vice President Harris had refused to publicly and privately concede the election, if President Biden had refused to commit to a peaceful transfer of power, if the Democrats tried to sue their way into the White House, if the Democrats conspired to send fake electors to Congress so that Vice President Harris could preside over her own victory, if Democrats tried to foment an insurrection as a last-ditch measure to prevent Donald Trump's victory or his certification, Dave Rubin and Ben Ferguson would be flipping the F out. But because it's Trump, they grade him on a curve. And even from Piers Morgan of all people, saying, guys, okay, come on. Biden was able to do this. Kamala was able to do this. Trump was not able to do this. Shouldn't he have done it? You can't even agree to that. Like, yes, that was a huge moral and political failing of Donald Trump. He should not have done that. It was disgraceful. And we hope he has changed, or we hope he's different. And that's why we support him. They can't even do that.
That argument. I would rather focus on what Joe Biden, I think, did right there, and what we now have in a very interesting, 2+ months of the remainder of the Biden administration, where basically Biden, or whatever's left of Biden, or whoever's driving Biden, no longer has to placate to the completely lunatic progressive fringe anymore. And Biden actually could take advantage of some of the reordering that we feel throughout the world right now, not just in America, but quite literally across the globe. And he can actually pave the way for a really nice transition into a Trump presidency that I believe is.
He committed to a peaceful transfer of power, Dave, you moron. These people are so incredibly stupid. It would be really great if Joe Biden would commit to, like, a really smooth transition into the Trump presidency. He did, you idiot. You just saw proof of that when he invited Donald Trump to the White House, which is something that's customary for presidents to do with presidents-elect. And Donald Trump didn't do that when he was the president and Joe Biden was the president-elect. The asymmetry, the moral superiority of Joe Biden over Donald Trump could not be more clear. And Dave Rubin just does not care.
Brian,
sure.
I thought it was very interesting, this meeting between Trump and Biden. They obviously can't stand each other. They've abused each other all year. But Biden did show him the respect of bringing him to the White House and shaking hands, and they talked about a smooth transition and stuff. I mean, that is good, isn't it? After the mayhem we saw 4 years ago. I mean, I liked to see that. What I would hope is that Trump, in his inauguration speech, hits a much more unifying tone than he did in 2016.
Right. I mean, I guess we're 8 years into new tone for Trump. It's never going to happen. He is not that person. Biden afforded him every ounce of respect that he couldn't be bothered to show, and that he couldn't be bothered to show Joe Biden or any Democrat over the last 4 years, while he lied about some big lie, and all of these right-wing mouthpieces perpetuated this lie with zero evidence, and they all just claimed that because Donald Trump was too small to admit that he lost, they all claimed that there must be some fraud, which magically disappeared as soon as 2024 rolled around.
All right,
so there was mass cheating that the Democrats figured out how to do when they didn't control government. But then when Democrats do control government, we just forgot to cheat this time around? The fact is that there is no acknowledgement from the right that for the last 4 years, these Republican officials that are listening to Donald Trump, these Republican mouthpieces like the ones on this panel, all lied because it served their political interests, but now they won't acknowledge that he was lying once it doesn't serve their political interests anymore.
All right, Ben, you've got your hand up.
Yeah. So again, it's absolutely true. And Brian makes an excellent point there, which is that Republicans, without any basis or substantiation, claimed that the 2020 election was stolen, but the Democrats didn't have their hands on the levers of power. And also, on many of the ballots that Biden won, Republicans won down ballot. So if Democrats were cheating in the election in 2020, why wouldn't they also, flip Senate seats and House seats and gubernatorial races to favor the Democrats? Why did they just stop at the top of the ticket? Why wouldn't they go for a complete theft of the election? And then, given that Democrats currently have more power than they did in 2020, Joe Biden is the most powerful man on earth, and he controls the Justice Department and the entire federal government, or at least in the executive branch. Why didn't they attempt to cheat again? And why was it that Donald Trump and Republicans were claiming that the election would be stolen and that Democrats would cheat and that it would be unfair and rigged? But then all those claims go away when Trump wins. So is it only cheating if you lose? Of course it is. And the Republicans know that. Again, just total dishonesty. And Brian Tyler Cohen was right to call them out on that. Another clip.
Yeah, let's go back to the question you asked. Is it good for America to see these two men shaking hands and talking? Yes. I actually think it's probably because Joe Biden experienced what Donald Trump experienced for 4 years. And that was people coming after you, trying to undermine you and having a coup on you. And when the big five of the Democratic Party excommunicated Joe Biden and said, we're going to force you out, I think he was probably the happiest man in America the night that Kamala Harris lost, because it was revenge for them kicking him out. So I think there is a different Joe Biden sitting with a different Donald Trump. I think Donald Trump is different now than he was in 2016. And I think these two men have experienced this level of persecution against them. And there probably is genuinely more respect now for the two of them than there has ever been in the last 8 years.
And Ben, hang on, Brian. Hang on, Brian. And Ben, hang on, Brian.
I've literally never heard such lazy commentary in my entire life.
Ben,
Brian, you're welcome, it's free.
I would also say that it wasn't Donald Trump who experienced a coup. Donald Trump attempted a coup in 2020 with both the fake elector scheme and the January 6, 2021 insurrection. So Ben, of course, per usual, as you'd expect from a Ted Cruz sidekick, by the way, it says something, given that Ted Cruz is the least liked person in the Senate to be his sidekick. It's like you're not even, you're such a loser. You're the biggest loser sidekick. You're not even the big cheese himself. Pretty weak.
Joe Biden was the happiest person in the world when Kamala Harris.
Let me ask you a question.
Yourself, my dude?
Excuse me. I run this panel at the moment. Ben, a question for you, Ben, because I put this forward on X and got a lot of blowback from MAGA Republicans. But I said, if Trump really wanted to set a different tone for the second administration, what about pardoning Hunter Biden? Not because I think he's innocent of the crimes, but because it would go a long way, perhaps, to showing the left that Trump is a different person, that he is prepared to forgive and move on. What do you think of that?
I think it's a terrible idea. I think you have to be held accountable for your actions. And I think the abuse of power by Hunter Biden, by Joe Biden's brother.
So, again, Ben Ferguson says, no, don't pardon Hunter Biden because there was abuse of power. Well, that's not the grounds and the basis for which Hunter Biden was prosecuted. Hunter Biden had no power to abuse because he was never part of the government. Unlike Donald Trump, President Biden didn't employ nepotism. Hunter Biden was not part of the Biden White House. He wasn't chief of staff. He wasn't senior advisor the way that Jared Kushner, Trump's son-in-law, was a senior advisor, effectively shadow secretary of state, or Ivanka Trump, Trump's own daughter, was a senior advisor as well. That's not what happened. But what's interesting is, that real need for accountability. Well, Brian Tyler Cohen makes a point that perhaps Ben Ferguson really doesn't have any ground or any leg to stand on there, that perhaps Ben Ferguson doesn't want accountability. What do you think?
Question here.
Yeah.
Piers, can I ask a question here?
Yes.
Ben, do you think that Donald Trump should go through with his sentencing then, because everybody should be held accountable for their crimes?
I don't know. I think the whole thing was a farce. I think the
It was
whole.
a
Do you think that
the whole
Donald Trump
Stormy
should be
Daniels
gonna hold
case,
up in the upper
I
courts.
think Joe
It was
Biden
crap.
should pardon him and end the
Do you
whole
think
thing
that?
now.
Do you think that Donald Trump should be allowed to be continued being prosecuted for in the Washington D.C. case, or the classified documents case, or the Georgia RICO prosecution, since everybody has to
No,
be held
because I
accountable
think
for their
it's
crimes?
very clear that it says you cannot go after a sitting president, and I think we all know
That's
his
not what
law
I asked
here. And
you.
every
That's
time
not
it's
what I
moved-
asked you.
I just
You said-
answered the
that's not what
question.
I
I
asked
just said no. The first thing came out of my mouth was the word no, and then I explained why. You need to
So
listen.
you said
I
everybody should
no.
be held accountable for their crimes, but not Trump.
The American people just held Donald Trump accountable, and they said they thought it was crap, and they reelected
That's
him.
not-
Pay
that's not
attention.
So, again, this is how dumb Ben Ferguson is and how he is unable to articulate an argument. So we're talking about the law, and then he's deliberately conflating it with elections, which are not a consequence of law when it suits him. So when it comes to law, people who are found guilty or under investigation should face accountability for their wrongdoings. What about Donald Trump, who was convicted on 34 felonies in the New York case? By the way, Piers Morgan says Joe Biden should pardon him there. Well, those are state charges. President Biden doesn't have the authority to pardon those. That would be Governor Kathy Hochul of New York. Set that aside. Well, Ben Ferguson's like, no, well, that's different because you can't charge a sitting president according to the Office of Legal Counsel. Well, again, that is a technicality. We're talking about is, do you think there should be accountability for Trump? Not will there be. You've given a great reason as to why there will be no accountability for Trump, because he's about to be the sitting president and he can't prosecute sitting presidents. And that's been the tradition for 50 years. What about should, as a moral issue, should Donald Trump be held accountable? And the answer is no, not to Ben Ferguson. Why? Well, because he won an election. Well, Hunter Biden could win an election. What's your point? And you wouldn't use the same logic. Well, Hunter Biden won this particular election for this particular office, ergo he should not be held legally accountable for his crimes. You see how they do a sleight of hand there? And by the way, we're talking about pardons. Well, the president has the power to pardon federal prosecutions. And Ben Ferguson's answer was no, Hunter Biden shouldn't be pardoned because he should be held accountable. Well, it's perfectly legal for President Biden or even future President Trump to pardon Hunter Biden. So again, you're not making a legal argument there because that's perfectly legal. Ben Ferguson is saying there's a moral imperative. Hunter Biden should not be pardoned. He should not be pardoned, even though he could be legally, because he should be held accountable for his crimes. Donald Trump, in theory, could be investigated, right, after he leaves office, or he could, I suppose, order the Justice Department to continue their investigations. Obviously, he would never do that. Then Ben Ferguson refuses to make the moral commitment and switches it to a question of legal technicality. They're so unprincipled. The honest answer is, well, if you believe that people should be held accountable for their actions, then of course you support accountability, not just for Hunter Biden, but also for Donald Trump. And you know what? Maybe at the end of the process, Donald Trump is found not guilty. Maybe he's exonerated. But you should want accountability if you're a principled person. But Ben Ferguson is not, nor is Dave Rubin. These are unprincipled, hypocritical losers. And all they care about at the end, the flow chart, the decision map for critical thinking or for principle is, does it benefit the Republican Party? Does it benefit Donald Trump? And that's it. That is the guiding principle. So anyway, great performance by David Pacman and Brian Tyler Cohen, triggering Dave Rubin and Ben Ferguson. And their lack of principle from these MAGA Republicans was once again put on full display. And I don't think we'll see the end of it. As a matter of fact, I think as Trump ascends to office again, we're only going to see more of it. Food for thought. In the meantime, let me know what you think in the comments.